Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Kristen Kuran-Fuller, Associate Director of the Fair Housing Center. I have the honor of welcoming you to our 10th annual Fair Housing Breakfast event. A few housekeeping items. Please continue to enjoy your breakfast buffet. On the back of your program, you'll find a QR code if you'd like to become a member of the FHC. Just point your camera at the code and a little link will pop up. When you leave today, please take a swag bag from the lobby. There'll be where your name tags were. Just please take one as you exit. All right, now back to the welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. Whether you are here in person or online, we appreciate your support of the work to ensure equal housing opportunities for all. This event would not be possible without our sponsors. Our 2023 sponsors, silver sponsors, are Community Financial Credit Union, McKinley Companies, Washtenaw County Office of Community and Economic Development, Old National Bank. Thank you so much for your partnership in this event. Our 2023 bronze sponsors are the Ann Arbor Area Board of Realtors, Bank of Ann Arbor, Beal Properties, Key Bank, Michigan Realtors, University Bank, and Zillow. Thank you again. And last but not least, thank you to our individual sponsors listed in your program. Please join me in giving all of our breakfast sponsors a round of applause. I want to take a moment now to also recognize Fair Housing Center members, those who donate annually. Can you raise your hand if you are a member of the Fair Housing Center? Thank you. A huge thank you to you because we cannot do this work without your continued support. When we all work together, we can make a real impact in ending illegal housing discrimination and promoting accessible communities. Thank you again to all of you for joining us. Now I'd like to invite FHC board member Diane Rosenblum up to introduce the Mark Mitshkun Board of Directors Award. Diane, welcome.
Good morning. It's great to be here today. I'm here to present the Mark Mitshkun Board of Directors Award. As some of you know, Mark was my husband, and he was a longtime board member of the Fair Housing Center. This award represents the work towards justice and fairness that Mark cherished. Each year, we give the award to someone who has done outstanding work in the areas of civil rights and fair housing. On December 24th, 2015, Courtney Atsalakis, Atsalakis' sister, Amber Reineck, fatally overdosed on fentanyl. 2 years after her sister's death, in 2017, Courtney founded a nonprofit organization, Amber Reineck House, in her sister's memory. She purchased a house on Walnut Street in the city of Howell to open as a recovery home for women with substance use disorder. At the time, there were no alternatives for women like her sister. The city, in violation of the Fair Housing Act, fought her at every turn. After 4 years of litigation, she prevailed. Amber Reineck House opened at another location and has been successfully serving women in Livingston County. It is my honor and privilege to present the Mark Mitshkun Board of Directors Award to Courtney Atsalakis. And here is Courtney. I want to read what the plaque says. The Fair Housing Center of Southeast and Mid-Michigan, the Mark Mitshkun Board of Directors Award presented to Courtney Atsalakis for bravely fighting against the city of Howell and winning the opportunity to transform the lives of so many women in recovery through Amber Reineck House. October 26, 2023. I'd like to invite the board to come up to the podium. Any board members who are here? I think they want to get a picture. Oh, okay. And I just wanted to say how special this is for me. I was very worried about getting up here and talking about Mark and giving the award, but my heart is full. Really.
I just want to say thank you for this award and thank you for all the work that Fair Housing does. I honor this so much on behalf of me and the Amber Reineck House, and without the work the Fair Housing Act does, we would not have known we were discriminated against, and they were with us every step of the way. So without them, we wouldn't be open. So thank you so much for supporting and all the work you do.
Hi, my name is Ed Mormon, and as you've just noticed, I'm a member of the board of the Fair Housing Center. I've been asked to come up and just state a few comments on how I became involved with the Fair Housing Center. Now, if you've noticed, I've moved from that podium because my students always said, "Doctor, would you please come from behind the desk and talk to us?" So that's what I'm going to try to do this morning. I retired 12 years ago, and my last assignment was in Africa. My wife and I were there for 10 years before returning home. And one of the things that I missed about Africa was life-changing joy that I was helped to bring about on people's faces. Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, when some of our employees actually finished a technical training course and received their first full-time paycheck, of which most didn't have a job before, you could see the joy on their faces. When we donated vans to orphanages and the kids didn't have to actually walk to the market every weekend and bring back supplies and groceries on a push cart, that's when we saw the joy on people's faces. So, oh, you can hear me now, okay. We didn't have microphones in the classroom, so I'm really not used to this, but in any event, and so there were just many examples that I could give you as to, is that better now? Many examples that I could give you about the joy that I saw on people's faces in Africa. And that's what I missed when I returned 12 years ago. Well, a good friend of mine, I was telling him about this. His name is Paul Haynes, and Paul was on the board at that particular point in time. He said, "Ed, don't worry. I know a place, and I'll take you there." Now, some of you might have recognized that those two sentences before. It's from a song by the, who is it from again? Oh, see there? The Staples Centers in 1972. But that was the type of person that Paul was, full of laughter, always joking, dry sense of humor, and you just loved him when you first met him. But the interesting thing is that Paul was correct. He did know a place, and that place is the Fair Housing Center. And so when I became involved with the Fair Housing Center, I really saw that type of joy on people's faces again. I remember the single mother who was able to move into an apartment with her young daughter in a safer neighborhood, and she didn't have to worry about her daughter going back and forth to school every day. I remember the gentleman in a wheelchair who was able to leave his building anytime he wanted to because a ramp was constructed on his building where it wasn't before. That was due to the excellent work of the Fair Housing Center. Now, all of this is not easy. It definitely takes dedication, patience, but also funding. And grants alone will not provide the total expense for that. Similar to Africa, it takes a village for the Fair Housing Center to be successful. And all of us here are a member, in fact, of that village. I was asked to mention that our goal for this event was $60,000. And we're very close to achieving that goal. As a matter of fact, we're $9,000 short. So we really need to close that gap, if you will, with your help. And there have been a few people, not me yet, but a few people who've already donated more than the $50 membership that it takes to become a member on the professional level. I won't call those people out. I won't embarrass you like that, but I'll just say thank you very much for making your additional donation. But we need all of your help. As a matter of fact, it's been calculated that if all of us were to donate $100, we would actually achieve our goal today. So I would like to ask for your support. But I wouldn't ask you to do anything that I wasn't willing to do myself. But before I say that, I'd like to mention that my friend Paul, he's no longer with us. He passed away 2 years ago. But his wife has continued to be involved in our organization, and she's right here today. Janet, would you please stand up? Thank you so much for your continued support. We really do appreciate it. As a matter of fact, I said I hadn't donated myself, and it's true, I haven't. But what my wife and I have decided to do is to donate today in memory of Paul. So that's something that we're going to do. And the way to do that is that on your programs, as Kristen mentioned, in the back, there's a QR code. So if you just tap that code with your phone, it should work. That's all I know about that, and I hope it works. But if it doesn't work, there are technically qualified people in the room who will come by and assist you. So with that, let's just take a few minutes and check that out, and we would really appreciate it. We'll just take a few minutes to do that. My wife just said credit card. Okay, so now, if you haven't finished, please take your time. And here again, if you need assistance, just raise your hand and some of our members will come around and assist you. Right now, I'd like to introduce our executive director, Pam Kish, who will then introduce the speaker, the guest speaker. Thank you very much.
Ed, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Diane. Congratulations again, Courtney. So thank you, Kristen, for getting us started, our associate director. Been with the Fair Housing Center for 15 years. So thank you to our board members. And if you're on the staff, will you raise your hand? Thank you to the staff who put this event together. And again, congratulations, Courtney. And I know that you have to leave early to get to the airport, so we understand. Thank you all for joining us today for our 10th annual Fair Housing Breakfast. Yeah. Welcome to the community leaders, the students, the housing professionals, lenders, attorneys, planners, advocates, elected officials, and our members. Whether you've been a member now for a few seconds or a few decades, we really can't do this work without you. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. John P. Relman is the founder and managing partner of Relman Colfax. Widely recognized as one of the nation's leading civil rights lawyers, John has pioneered groundbreaking fair housing and fair lending cases that have expanded the scope and reach of the Fair Housing Act. For more than 30 years, he has represented individual plaintiffs, cities, and civil rights organizations in many of the country's most important civil rights cases. These cases include Kennedy versus the city of Zanesville, where he won a $10.6 million jury verdict on behalf of citizens in a predominantly black area that had been denied city water services for 50 years. He was also involved in Fortune Society versus Sandcastle Towers, where the apartment owners refused to rent apartments to anyone with a criminal record. This blanket ban, Fortune alleged, was discriminatory and had an unlawful disparate impact based on race and color. The case settled for nearly $1.2 million. John has published and lectured extensively in the area of civil rights law and litigation. He is also the author of the widely used Housing Discrimination Practice Manual. Any of the attorneys here will know this giant red book that is constantly in use in our office. John and his firm have also been part of our success at the Fair Housing Center of Southeast and Mid-Michigan by training our cooperating attorneys, by advising us on investigative strategies, and representing our clients in cases like Keck versus Kensington Court, a case alleging that the Ann Arbor Hotel prevented a black couple, because of their race, from putting down a deposit and selecting a date for their wedding. And of course, Amber Reineck House versus the city of Howell, that recently settled for $750,000. John has a law degree from the University of Michigan and an undergraduate degree from Harvard. He was the speaker at our first Fair Housing Center breakfast, and we are thrilled to have him back for our 10th annual breakfast. Please help me welcome John Relman. Here.
That's great. Pam, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it is such a pleasure to be back here after 10 years. I've been back, I think, within the 10 years, but the last time I stood before you was literally 10 years ago, and it's just so wonderful to hear about all the work that's been going on and that all that you've accomplished, and to meet Amber and Becky and know about their great success that our firm was fortunate enough to be involved in. So, as Pam said, and I think I got the little thing here, great. As Pam said, I last stood before you in this breakfast, and I looked it up, and it was February of 2014. And I have to say that 10 years has gone quickly, but a lot has happened in those 10 years. And when I reflect on where I was then, the very first thing that occurred to me, let's see if I maybe point it here, point it down. Just tell me down. There we go. Sorry, I had the wrong direction. She was saying down, and I was doing up. Okay. The first thing that occurred to me was, as I was reflecting, was that 10 years ago, my father was still alive. This is a picture of us at Fenway Park, and he died in June 2014 at the age of 91. This was a few months before he passed. He had terminal cancer, which he learned about shortly before I spoke here. And then he told me, I remember it was just right after I had spoken here. In his last months, we talked a lot about life and death. And you know, he was a doctor, he was a scientist, and he never feared death. He believed very much in what he called the circle of life. He did say, though, that I would like to be able to stick around to see how things will turn out. And that was very much his feeling, you know, like it would be nice to stick around just to see how things play out. And in these intervening 10 years, I often imagine how nice it would be to conjure him up so that we could talk. And then I think, if he were able to talk with me today, the first thing he would ask would be, so what happened while I was gone, right? And he was someone who believed in getting right to the point. He didn't like to mince words. And that meant that I would have to essentially distill the last 10 years to the really important stuff, just the headlines. So I thought, perfect. So I was thinking about today. The first thing I wanted to start with was zoom out and think for a second about what has happened since I was last here at the first breakfast. What are the headlines? Okay, so let's kind of go through the top 10, as it were. All right, in politics, I don't think any of us 10 years ago saw this coming. By that I mean the election of Donald Trump as president. Nor did any of us think that we would see January 6th happen and a siege of the Capitol. There have been seismic changes on the Supreme Court. It is further to the right than at any point in my lifetime. And we'll talk about what this means for fair housing in a few minutes. But that would certainly make it in my list of the big things in the last 10 years. Worldwide, nobody saw the pandemic coming 10 years ago. A once-in-a-100-year event, not really seen, if you think about it, since the pandemic of 1918 or the bubonic plague of the Middle Ages. I remember when the pandemic started, I would have said back in 2014 that we thought that modern science had thankfully relegated unchecked global plagues to the dustbin of history. And talking about the world stage, who would have imagined a war involving a superpower on the border of Europe with no end in sight after 2 years of carnage? Back home, I think I would certainly have mentioned to my father about this nationwide civil rights awakening not experienced since 1967, around the death of George Floyd. And of course, 1967 was right before the Fair Housing Act was passed, more than 50 years ago. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In the world of computers and technology and science, a profound advance in the area of artificial intelligence that I would say, and I think many would agree, will have vast implications for every aspect of our lives, including civil rights. And I will touch on that in a minute as well. Now, of course, when it comes to entertainment, which I think would have interested my father a little bit less, he might have zoned out on this part when I told him what was the big news there. What were the big moments of the last 10 years? Well, I think you have to include Barbenheimer, right, from this summer. And of course, the very biggest news of the last 10 years, the biggest headline, it's gotta be Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift. I mean, can you imagine what's gonna happen if the Chiefs make it to the Super Bowl? It's gonna be insanity. Okay. All right. Now, before we get into the real stuff, a pop quiz. I want to ask you, Can anyone name the last time that there was a mashup of this worldwide magnitude involving a pop music star at the top of her career and a sports icon also at the top of his career? Is anybody, there got to be some people who are as old as I am in this audience who remember what was the last time. Anybody want to take a guess? Marilyn Monroe? I'm not sure about that one. It's just this sports pop star. Yeah, that's kind of close. Okay. Yes, winner. Who said that? All right. Exactly. Beckham, right? And and which of the Spice Girls was this? Posh Spice. Very good. Very good. Okay. All right. For me, the last 10 years started, as I said, with a family memory involving a loss, and they have ended with two other important family memories that reflect my father's concept of a circle of life. The first involves the family that I call our law firm, our civil rights law firm. Last February, one of my law partners, Gia Cobb, was sworn in as a federal district court judge on the United States District Court for the District of Columbia by Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. And for me, that was just an incredible moment. I just have to pause and tell you, because if I really think back the last 10 years, I stood before all of the assembled judges at the investiture to say a few words about Gia at her request. I first met Gia in 2006. She was a summer student at our firm. And if you can imagine that, then came back to the firm, became a partner at the firm, and then ascended to the court. This is a circle of life moment. She's 40 years old, and I thought, you know, this is an incredible moment because I'm 66, and for the first time, I felt, you know, I'm not going to be here when necessarily when she's my age or even a little bit older, but the feeling of knowing that the values that we share, that she will carry on to this judicial career and to the next steps that she might take are absolutely profound for me. And it's a feeling that the civil rights movement is a movement. It's something that we pass on to the next half generation and the next half generation after that. It's something it's never done, but it's a great feeling when you know that your work and your ideas will carry on past you. And that was kind of an epiphany moment for me to realize that that in fact would happen. And the second moment of these last 10 years that I would say was a circle of life moment for me was just last month on September 21st when my wife and I became grandparents for the first time. We have so many young children in the office now that we actually have office swag that is baby blankets, if you can believe it. And this is Gia Relman. She was born a month ago to my oldest daughter, Katrin, and literally it's Gia. It's spelled with a G, not a J, and I swear I had nothing to do with the name, but for me to have Gia Cobb take the bench and Gia Relman be born was a profound moment of that circle of life. So it's been, as I think back on it, quite a 10-year period. A lot has happened indeed. This exercise of reflection is not one that is sort of that I'm randomly beginning this discussion with this morning. It's something that I think is important to do, to zoom out. And I want to get you in that frame now of zooming out and of thinking of big picture time periods, a 10-year time period, or even a 50 or 60-year time period, because It's moments like this where if we can reflect on those broader time periods, many times we can draw lessons from that when you're down in the weeds of the day-to-day, it's hard to see. So I want to encourage you to take this cue where I've started by saying what happened in the last 10 years, to now zoom your minds out and think big with me for a minute. We're going to think some bigger thoughts and try and connect the dots. I want to see where we stand with fair housing and take that same approach. It's been about 55 years now since Congress passed the Fair Housing Act. It was passed in 1968 to address discrimination and segregation. In some areas, we have made progress. In others, though, the disparities and the segregation remains as bad or worse than they were in 1968. And the question that we have to ask is why? Why isn't it even better? Why are we still facing levels of segregation that are unacceptable or disparities that are unacceptable? And of course, we have to ask the second question, the follow-on question, which is, what can we do about it? That's really the important question. And to answer those questions, I want to talk for a few minutes about what I've learned in my nearly 40 years practicing as a civil rights lawyer. And as I said, I want to try and connect the dots from what I've seen, from what I've experienced, from organically, as I've gone along in my career, the cases that I've done. And I want to identify what I think are the challenges that we face. I think, as you can tell from the title of my remarks today, I think that this is a very important moment. Fair housing stands at a crossroads, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. First of all, let me back up and talk a little bit about where we stand now with fair housing and why. As I said, I'm a civil rights lawyer, and for 38 years, I've been litigating civil rights cases around the country. I started out as a trial lawyer at a nonprofit called the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And probably the best known case I did there was the Denny's restaurant discrimination case. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. There we go. This case started when 6 African-American Secret Service agents on President Clinton's detail were denied service at a Denny's in Annapolis, Maryland. It turned out, when we got into the case, that Denny's had trained its management at its 1,700 restaurants around the country that African-American customers were not wanted because they believed they did not tip and were likely to leave without paying for their food. The year was 1993. The case turned into a national class action, and it settled for more than $50 million. In 1999, I decided to start a civil rights law firm. I wanted to create a hybrid, a firm with the civil rights mission of a not-for-profit like the Lawyers Committee, but with the efficiencies and the autonomy of a for-profit. We started with 3, and now, 23 years later, there are about 45 of us who are all working on cases around the country. The cases that our firm does often involve what I call mapping discrimination. And I want to explain for a second what this means and why it's important, and then offer a few thoughts about the lessons our cases have taught me about racial and economic justice in America. Now, there are lots of civil rights laws that we rely on to do our work, but the main tool in our box is the Fair Housing Act. As I said, it was passed in '68 at the time of Dr. King's assassination, and its purpose was to break down overt barriers to housing by outlawing racial discrimination in the private market and to promote integration by addressing the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow laws. So, combat discrimination and promote integration. 55 years later, as I said, while some progress towards integration has been made, the maps show that we still live apart. These are dot density maps, and each dot that you see here that makes up the color code is a household. The green that you see is African American. The blue is non-Hispanic white. The red is Asian. The orange yellow is Hispanic. This is Detroit, and you can see how stark the differences are. The dividing line here in this map is 8 Mile Road. The very same pattern exists in other cities. If we look at Atlanta, you can see how stark the divide is in a similar fashion. If you look at Chicago, the same pattern. On the north side, white. South side, African American. To the west, African American, Hispanic. If you look at Washington, D.C., this is our nation's capital, remarkably segregated, with the middle where you see it's white going up to the top. That's Rock Creek Park that divides the city between literally black and white. And, of course, Memphis. Over here to the left side is the Mississippi River. And you can see that the African American part of Memphis starts in the north and wraps around just to the east of where the downtown is, and then comes along South Memphis, with white families living in that middle stretch heading to the east. I show Memphis because Memphis is a particularly good example. And like the cities that I just showed, we can overlay a few simple measures of opportunity and quality of life that show the connection between race, place, and outcome. I want to talk about that for a second. Race, place, and outcome. So in this map, what is drawn here in the red are census tracts with what's called persistent poverty. These are defined as areas where at least 20% of the population has lived below the poverty line for 30 years or more. You can see where they land. If we map schools on top of this, same result. This map shows the worst performing public schools in red, according to the Department of Education, and the best performing schools in yellow. You can see where they land. If we look at bank branch locations, most are in white areas. You want to get a loan, you want to talk to somebody about the options, this is where the bank branches are located, the physical bank branches. And finally, if we show evictions, in this picture, what you can see is that the bigger the circle of red is the larger number of evictions per 100 households. And you can see, again, in this map, the darker blue is the African American neighborhoods of Memphis. You can see where the evictions land. The disparate outcomes shown on the maps can also be seen in statistical disparities. So if we look at the disparities in home ownership and median household wealth, we see that they remain basically unchanged since 1968. In these graphs, the green is African American, the blue is non-Hispanic white, and when we look at home ownership rate, median household wealth, the disparities are largely unchanged in the 50-year period after the Fair Housing Act. I will say the numbers I've seen recently are that the household median wealth that disparity has reduced just a little bit, but it is still enormous. A little bit in the last 6 years, but it is still enormous. And the question is, one more slide, unemployment rates, much higher for African American, even infant mortality rates, much higher for African American. Now, of course, the absolute number of deaths of infants is way down since the data was first kept in 1850, and literally the United States started tracking these numbers in 1850. But the relative rate of infant mortality is still way higher for African American mothers than for non-Hispanic white mothers. And the question is, why are we still living apart? Why the continuing disparities 50 years after passage of the Fair Housing Act? The cases that our firm has been involved in over the last 20 years have helped me to connect the dots. One answer, I believe, has to do with the persistence of overt race discrimination, blatant discrimination, the type that I saw at Denny's back in 1993. 3 examples I want to give of that in these cases. So the first is the case that Pam had mentioned in Zanesville. In 2004, we took on this case in Zanesville, Ohio, near Columbus, where an historically African-American community of 60 families located in Coal Run had been denied public water for 50 years. You can see the Coal Run area here in yellow on this map. It's a small area, and it's nestled right up against the city of Zanesville. This is coal mining country. It borders on Appalachia. The water runs red. You just can't dig a well deep enough to get clean water. The city of Zanesville had a public water plant located a mile from Coal Run that provided clean water to the white neighborhoods right next to Coal Run, but stopped where the black homes started. So here you can see where the pipes ran and where the Coal Run neighborhood is. And then when we mapped the houses that were black households, white households, and that had water, the water stopped literally at the households where the black community began. And the water went right around Coal Run and then far out to the white communities in rural Washington Township, which is all white. This map is so important. We mapped this to show where the water ran, how it went out to the far-flung reaches. And what we learned was that, of course, Muskingum County said, well, it would have cost too much to deliver water to Coal Run. But these pipes went to communities that had just a handful of people miles out. After the trial, we finished presenting the evidence. The jurors deliberated for a period of time. And when they finished, we got to talk to the jury. And I said, we got to ask them, the judge let us ask them, what was the most important piece of evidence that they had seen? And this map we got to show in opening argument. The trial had gone for 6 weeks. So we put all of the people on the stand, 6 weeks of trial. The foreperson of the jury said immediately, oh, we decided after we saw the map in opening argument. And I thought, man, we could have saved a lot of time if we had just ended it right there. But that was the first indication back in 2008 of confirmation of what I knew was true, which was mapping this is so important to be able to see what's happening and to tell people the story, to connect those dots. A second case of overt discrimination, this one in Louisiana, tells, this was the end of the case here. We brought water, and as Pam said, a $10.6 million damages verdict to the families. The second case is in Louisiana, but it's a very similar story about overt discrimination. St. Bernard Parish is all white. It lies next to New Orleans, just across from the 9th Ward, which is predominantly black. In 2006, fearful that African American families displaced by Hurricane Katrina would resettle in St. Bernard, the parish made it illegal to rent property to anyone who was not a family member related by blood. We sued St. Bernard and struck down the law. Very clear law designed to perpetuate segregation. Barely a year later, after learning that a developer wanted to build affordable housing in the parish that might attract residents of the 9th Ward, the parish passed a new law, this time making it illegal to build multifamily housing. This in a community that had been ravaged by Hurricane Katrina and desperately needed housing, passed a moratorium to stop multifamily housing, which was exactly what the residents needed, all because of a concern that African American families would cross the Industrial Canal and live with them in St. Bernard Parish. We represented the developer and we sued St. Bernard again. The battle was exceptionally ugly. The judge was targeted. Local coverage depicted the case as state and local rights versus federal jurisdiction, literally back to the days of George Wallace standing in the door of the school. After 3 evidentiary hearings in federal court and findings of contempt that included daily fines of up to $10,000 that were levied against the parish, we won the right to build the housing. 200 units of affordable housing are in St. Bernard Parish right now. It is fully integrated. And the story there is the story that I've seen over and over again, and that indeed Becky just told me moments ago had happened again in Howell, which was once the stereotypes had been blown apart and people had actually moved in and people could see that they were human beings just like them and that they were contributing members of their community, they were embraced. And that has been an enormous success story in St. Bernard Parish. But it took us 3 years of legal battle where we were threatened. We were physically threatened being there in St. Bernard Parish. The judge was targeted in order to make this happen. This case makes the same point as Zanesville. In too many communities, we still face Denny's-type discrimination. Denny's was 1993. Zanesville was 2008. St. Bernard was 2012. In each time this happened, my white friends would say to me, "Does this still happen?" And my black friends would say, "Welcome to my world." The third case is one that we filed just last year. Nathan Connolly and Shawnee Mott are professors at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. They're African American. They own a home in a predominantly white area of Baltimore. Predominantly white area of Baltimore. They applied for a loan at Loan Depot, an online lender. The bank assigned an appraiser who came to the house, met Professors Connolly and Mott, and then appraised the house at $472,000, which was well below the tax value of the property. They did not qualify for the loan. Now, convinced that they had been discriminated against because of their race, they applied again at Rocket Mortgage and were assigned a new appraiser. This time, though, they decided to do what is now known as a whitewashing experiment. They asked white neighbors who were friends of theirs to show the house when the appraiser came as if the white neighbors were the owners. They took down their black art. They hung up a white Jesus on the wall. The appraisal came back at $750,000, and they qualified for the loan. Professors Connolly and Mott, I want to say, are not alone. These whitewashing experiments have been repeated by black homeowners across the country in the last several years, and with remarkably similar results. The evidence shows the same conclusion in the area of appraisals that we saw in Zanesville and Denny's. It's 2023, but overt racial discrimination is still happening in communities across the country. The data, as you can see here, matches what homeowners actually see in their daily lives, black homeowners see in their daily lives when they cannot access the wealth that they have built in their homes the same ways that whites can. Now, that's the first type of case, and that's the first lesson. This overt discrimination still goes on, and we have to face that fact. But there's a second type of case that we see, one that involves a more subtle, but what I call equally pernicious discrimination that keeps us living apart, that contributes to segregation. This is something that I call institutional or structural racism, where a company exploits segregated living patterns to make money. I don't believe in terms for the sake of terms, because they can become jargon, but I do believe in explaining what a term means. And as I say, when I say institutional racism, I mean a company that takes advantage of an existing segregated living pattern simply to make money. In 2008, in the midst of the home mortgage foreclosure crisis, we sued Wells Fargo for targeting African American communities in Memphis and Baltimore for toxic predatory loans. This is Memphis, and the black dots are foreclosures. They're mostly in the African American neighborhoods. If you look, though, when we mapped where the good loans go, these are prime loans. These are Wells Fargo's prime loans. You can see they land mostly in the white community. And if you look at where their subprime or toxic loans went, they went much more heavily in the black community of Memphis. Ex-employees that we uncovered and spoke to in our investigation confessed that Wells Fargo had deliberately targeted black neighborhoods for these toxic subprime loans, even where people qualified for prime loans. And they did this because they knew the folks who have been historically denied good loans would say yes, and they knew where those folks were located. The Justice Department intervened, and the cases settled for more than $200 million in damages to families who had been overcharged or lost their homes. Even if not intentionally discriminatory in the same way as Denny's, the effect of Wells' practices caused enormous harm and contributed to the current disparity in household wealth we find in minority neighborhoods. These practices have a historic link to government-mandated overt discrimination. In 1933, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was an agency established in the New Deal to provide low-interest loans to homeowners facing foreclosures, established the first redlining maps. These maps were designed to instruct lenders and insurers what areas were safe for them to operate in, where they could make loans, and which were hazardous and to be avoided. The maps like this one were created for every single city in the country. This is the map for Memphis. And what you see here are the color codes that showed where you should lend and where you shouldn't. The red areas were defined as quote-unquote hazardous. The yellow areas were defined as quote-unquote declining. The green and blue are best, respectively, and desirable. Those were the words they used. And now if you compare this map and remember back in your mind the map that I showed of Memphis about where people live today, and we actually go to that map, you can see that the red and the yellow correspond largely where the African American community still lives today, and the green and the blue where the white community resides. And it is exactly those red and yellow areas, exactly the areas where Wells Fargo targeted their subprime toxic loans that they knew people were likely to fail in and foreclose in. Wells did that because at the time of closing, they made money. And then they sold the loans on the secondary market, and other institutions like Fannie Mae, like Deutsche Bank, like others went under as a result. But Wells did fine because at the time of closing, the higher the price of the loan, the higher the amount of the loan, the more they charged in points and fees, the more money they made. Exploitation of segregated living patterns to make money. That's my definition of structural racism. So if past is prologue, it should be no surprise that race, place, and outcome are connected. It started that way, and as long as segregation continues, it's likely to remain that way. What do I take away from these two different types of cases? A couple of things. Cases are anecdotal data points. They're really nothing more than a window on a lived experience. But it's very much a relived experience over many years of doing this work, now 38. And here are 4 takeaways that I want to share with you. The first is that racial and economic justice go together in this country. They have always been connected. You can't really understand how to address one, by that I mean economic injustice, without addressing the other, racial injustice. The second is something that we all know, but sometimes we need to zoom out to remember and think about. Where we live matters. It determines outcomes and opportunities. Discrimination in many of our cases is made possible because there is a defined minority community to target or exclude. If we could figure out how to maintain stable, integrated communities, I believe it would go a long way toward reducing both economic and racial inequalities. Third, of all civil rights laws, fair housing stands at the center. Where one lives affects where you go to school, opportunities for jobs and connections, the right to vote, health outcomes, and much, much, much more. We have to protect this law, the Fair Housing Act. And as I'm going to discuss in my final remarks in a minute, it is under attack as we speak, hence the Crossroads. Fourth and finally, getting this right, and by that I mean figuring out how to reduce the growing economic and racial inequality in our society is really, really, really important. Historically, democracies without a stable middle class that provides economic opportunity for both majority and minority communities have not fared well. You can look through recent history, long-time history. The lesson is the same. Without a stable middle class, big, growing middle class that reduces disparities, democracies fail. Our democracy is strongest when we focus on building a just society. And to do that, we have to be honest about our past and the hold that it still has on us. I think mapping discrimination this way and talking about it this way in a courtroom or in a room like this is a start to that problem. And I want to just say one thing about that democracy point. We can be from different sides of the ideological spectrum when it comes to our view about what makes for a successful economy, right? We can be a free market person or someone who believes in more government intervention on the other side. But what we have to agree on, is no free market survives without a democracy. Free markets don't make it under dictatorships. So if we want to have a free market where we can all do well, we have to start with a democracy. And that means we have to address this problem of growing economic inequality. And logically, that is so connected with the racial injustice, we have to address the two together. Okay, I want to end by talking about why do I say fair housing is at a crossroads? I think it's because right now we face some existential threats. And what do I mean by that? I mean challenges that go to the heart of how we have been fighting discrimination and segregation up until now. And this is something now that in my mind is shifted. It's a little bit different in important ways than it was 10 years ago. The first existential threat is generative AI. Left to run its course unchecked, generative AI, this chat GPT is probably what we're most familiar with, scrapes data from the World Wide Web that is infected with bias and literally builds that into the predictions that it makes for American business to use. So if we think about all of that foreclosure data that was generated by the predatory lending we just discussed, generative AI, left unchecked, will combine that foreclosure data with zip code data to render predictions about home values and likelihoods of default in black neighborhoods that are preordained to disadvantage black applicants who are seeking loans and appraisals. A self-fulfilling prophecy based on past discrimination, based on the very predatory practices that reinforced and made those foreclosures much worse in black communities. Even those who have created generative AI, the founders themselves, fear its destructive powers across vast swaths of our culture and economy. And I put it here next to Oppenheimer because some liken it to the existential threat that the technology leap that allowed us to split the atom caused back in 1945. Now, that is not to say we don't have options here. We can address this threat with proper regulation and oversight of generative AI, but we have to be clear-eyed and far-sighted about what destructive power this potentially has. Second, in the more granular area of civil rights and fair housing law, we face existential threats to our ability to bring cases and to prove violations and win remedies. The first has to do with standing. Back in 1982, the Supreme Court held in this famous Havens case that fair housing organizations, like the Fair Housing Center here, could bring cases in court where they could show that their mission had been frustrated and their resources diverted by violations of the Fair Housing Act. That precedent has held for more than 50 years. Now, there is reason to believe that the conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, is prepared to revisit this precedent. Increasingly, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal court that covers a few southern states, has become the proving ground for precedent-breaking cases that end up in the Supreme Court. The latest is a ruling in a case involving the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. It's called Azalea Garden, and it does a pretty good job of gutting Havens. If Azalea Garden becomes the law of the land, if it goes up to the Supreme Court, which it could, or a similar case could, fair housing organizations will have a very hard time bringing cases to enforce the Fair Housing Act. The second involves a theory of liability known as disparate impact. That theory says that a policy that causes a disparate impact on a protected group can violate the Fair Housing Act if there's a less discriminatory way to accomplish the same governmental or business objective. It was upheld by the Supreme Court in 2015 in a case we call inclusive communities. Now, this, not to get too granular in the law, but big picture, it's a really, really important tool in our toolbox to fight segregation because it challenges government and business to look for the least discriminatory policies and use those instead of ones that disadvantage protective groups unnecessarily. Justice Alito has made clear for a long time that he does not like this theory. And other justices in the conservative majority on the High Court have made clear that, notwithstanding this recent Supreme Court decision, which should be binding precedent, may be reopened, just as they did in the areas of abortion and other areas. This court is ready to relook at things that we thought were settled. The third threat concerns our ability to fashion remedies to the discriminatory practices we find. You know, I've been talking now about the cases that we've brought that established the violations, that showed how the Fair Housing Act was violated, how the discrimination happened. But there's a whole nother part. Proving that a policy or practice violates the Fair Housing Act is actually, in one sense, kind of meaningless if there's no way under the law to address the racial and economic disparities that it creates. In other words, there's got to be the ability to bring a remedy, and a remedy that matters. Last June, the Supreme Court struck down race-based affirmative action in college admissions. That's this case, Students for Fair Admissions. That decision has now triggered challenges to race-conscious policies and programs across the business world that have long been used to build diverse and profitable workforces or incentivize investment in underserved communities. That goes to everything from simply saying to a manager, I'm going to evaluate you based on your ability to build a diverse workforce. Why does that matter to American business? Why does that matter to the CEOs of Fortune 100 companies? I tell you, it is because every single one of those CEOs will tell you, I deliver more shareholder value with a diverse workforce than without. Every single study shows that by every single major researcher, consultant, over and over across the world. Diversity is profitable. CEOs may not care about diversity as a moral value, but they want to make money and they want to deliver value. And the question now is, can they do it? Can they actually do it if they incentivize their managers and say, you will be graded based on a diverse workforce? Is somebody like Edward Blum and Students for Fair Housing now going to bring that case to the Supreme Court and challenge it? And what does that mean for the sustainability and the competitiveness of American business? Back in the predecessor case to this one, in 2003, when the Supreme Court last ruled on affirmative action in the University of Michigan case that you may remember, where they upheld it, the Joint Chiefs of Staff filed a brief that said diversity in leadership of the military is essential to national security. Don't take it away from us. This was our generals who protect our country. And now it's going to be the captains of industry who are going to be saying, don't take this away from us. But the cases have already started. A challenge to law firms that have programs that incentivize or prioritize looking for diverse young lawyers. JP Morgan has been sued over an investment fund they had that prioritized investments for African American women who own affordable housing companies. These challenges are just starting now, and this is an existential threat, because how far the Supreme Court goes in applying this affirmative action ruling, how far it goes in applying this very facile and easy phrase that Justice Roberts used, which is, we need to be race blind, right? Sounds good, but what does it mean, right? What does it mean if it destroys our ability to dismantle segregation, if it destroys our ability to bring our society together in ways that create prosperity for everyone? If it goes too far, it's going to have an important impact on our ability to design policies that, as I say, promote integration and address this racial wealth gap. Looking ahead, though, I know it sounds like a downer, but I actually am very optimistic, and I want to say two big picture reasons why. I could stand here for the next hour and a half and talk about housing policy and all the things that are going on around the country where communities are passing legislation and organizing and energizing the community to deal with these issues of segregation in ways that are getting a toehold and are making progress, right? I could talk to you about that, but I want to stay big picture, because big picture is what we have to think about. And so there are two reasons, pretty basic. One is that politics in this country is difficult to predict. Anything can happen at any moment. And I just want to say, as long as we preserve our democracy, we have the power to shape the outcome. Laws are written by our elected officials. The laws can override, in many cases, even what the Supreme Court can say or do. If we want to change things, we have the power to do it as long as we have our democracy. So the second thing I want to say about, and the last thing about why I'm optimistic, is that notwithstanding the conservative supermajority that rules the Supreme Court right now, if we think back to how the modern civil rights movement began nearly 70 years ago, history tells us that over time, unjust decisions do not hold, and that the moral arc of the universe does indeed bend toward justice. This is not the first time we've been here. Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, was once the law of the land, endorsed by a Supreme Court. That changed very fast with Brown versus Board. And think how differently things became when we as a society had the ability through political change to render a result where Thurgood Marshall, the individual who argued Brown versus Board, ascended to the Supreme Court himself to become a justice. This is all possible again for us to have the moral outcome that we want, along with the just and economically meaningful results that we want, a better society that delivers more for all of us, that brings us together. We can shape that any way we want, no matter what political stripe you are. We have to preserve our democracy. We have to come together. And together, we have the power through our political system to shape it any way we want. If we want to end the segregation, if we want to deal with these growing racial and economic disparities, we have the power to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Why don't you come back, because I think we're going to have questions. Are there any questions?
Don't be shy.
Oh, yeah, I think.
Thank you so much.
Can you hear me? Okay, where was the question? Okay.
John, in 2024?
I don't think so.
Thank you. No other questions? Oh, there we go.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to focus in on your concept of structural racism. And there's a lot of people in the room work for banks, lenders, real estate agents, things like that. What is one thing you can tell each one of them about the work they do that they could do to identify and work against structural racism in their fields?
That's a great question. And, I would say, first of all, I want to say that there are the civil rights advocates in this room and around the country have many, many allies in the business community, people who care deeply and are doing important things. I mean, I would say, first and foremost, you can, within your own business, start at home and look within and say, are we doing, first of all, everything that we can do to empower our workforce to be as equitable and fair as it can be? Are we doing everything we can to ensure that we have not simply people who have the credentials to do the job, but that we have a diverse workforce? Because with a diverse workforce comes, as I say, much greater chance for profitability, more ideas, more viewpoints in the room. And that's something to really challenge yourself on. Are we doing everything we can to build that? The second is to say, what are we doing to ensure that our practices are not simply avoiding having any kind of discriminatory effect on underserved communities? Are we looking at our policies not just to say, are they reinforcing some kind of existing barrier that's there, but rather to say, what are we doing to reach out to invest in underserved communities in ways that make sense, in ways that make sense from a business standpoint, and also help that community? Let me give you one example. We recently completed a racial equity audit, a civil rights audit for a huge financial institution, State Street Bank, that the shareholders demanded that they do a review of their practices. And our job was to scour the company top to bottom and figure out what were the things that they could be doing, where could they be putting their money, how could they be using the billions and billions of dollars that they have to, or whatever resources they had, to help underserved communities. One really simple thing was that they have enormous resources, enormous capital that they simply hold and safeguard. And one of the things that they do is they put that money into institutions to simply, they put it into banks to just earn interest for investors. They just put it into money markets that are guaranteed by the federal government. The money is safe. They can choose wherever they want to put it, but they have control of large amounts of money. And one of the things that they just hadn't even thought about doing was saying, let's make sure that 2% of our resources, which is an enormous amount of money, goes into minority deposit institutions, black-owned banks, for example. There are black-owned banks that may be the biggest in a particular state, and if they put 10 or 15 or $20 million just simply to sit in that bank and earn interest in a treasury bond, it makes an enormous amount of difference to that local community, because that black-owned bank is using that money to support local black-owned business in that community. And that in turn creates jobs. And that addresses the racial wealth gap. And the only thing the bank had to do was simply push a button and say, we're going to choose this bank over that bank. And the money is equally well protected. They get the same return for their investors, but no one had thought, are we intentional about how we're doing it, right? Those types of questions where you simply take a step back and review, what are you doing to support your local community? Not as charity, that's good too, and I should say perhaps not just as charity, but also as part of your business plan to empower businesses and communities that have been denied the opportunities through these patterns of segregation and exploitation.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you. Haywood Edwards with Mitshkun. As we embark on testing, we work with the Fair Housing Centers to do testing of some of our multifamily units. There are other areas that have really been of great interest to me lately, and as you mentioned with the banks, there's data, with application approval and denial, but there are also other areas where there is no data. For example, it's the initial visit to the bank and that encounter with the receptionist or whoever works at the bank, where they may discourage someone from applying, like, what's your credit score? Oh, you don't have a credit score, you shouldn't even apply here. And so we've been having a lot of conversations as far as how to target areas like that. So could you speak on that? It's those pieces of the puzzle where there is no data, where we have to dig a little deeper. I'm interested to hear your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, that's really, really important. Thank you. I mean, let me give one example. So in the Connolly case that I mentioned, the appraisal discrimination case, if you think back, and this is all in the complaint, the case is still being litigated, and what I'm talking about is in the complaint itself. But in the complaint, Professors Connolly and Mott allege that when they complained about discrimination to the first bank, they said, this appraisal is flawed. We can point you to 6 errors or whatever it is in the complaint, in the appraisal, We can show you comparables that are different. When they made clear that they thought it was discriminatory, the allegation is that the bank, that the loan officer refused at that point, or stopped, not refused, but stopped communicating with them. And one of the things, and that they then did not have any opportunity to ask for a second appraisal, or that the communication that could have led to them understanding their options or to getting assistance wasn't there. That's the nature of the allegation in the complaint. That raises the question, just what you're talking about, which is this: what kind of approach or policy does a bank have to what's called reconsideration of value? Now, there isn't good data that most banks keep about how do they treat customers who ask for help, or what efforts do they make on their behalf. It's my own personal view from 38 years of litigating and seeing what happens inside banks that I wouldn't be surprised if there are disparities, significant disparities, if we could actually document them, in how people are treated. And indeed, in the Connolly case, once the allegations became public, several people came forward, and it was in the paper, several people came forward and said that they, in fact, had not made any allegation of racial discrimination in challenging an appraisal by the very same loan officer at this bank, but that he had helped them out enormously to make sure that the appraisal wasn't a barrier to getting a loan. That's anecdotal, and it remains to be seen what the data in that bank would show. But the question is, even without that data, how do banks go about self-regulating and self-reflecting on how they treat people? And it's all about good compliance management systems. It's about making sure that you have clear policies, and it's making sure that your employees understand those policies, understand their obligations under the law, and then that you have a way to monitor it. So you can do your own analysis. You can do your own statistical look. You can escalate those complaints of discrimination and make sure that every single one is treated the same way, and that you're handling reconsiderations of value in the same way. And the same is true for, the New York Times wrote an article a couple of years ago where they cataloged what they called banking while black. And these were experiences where customers had come in to major banks, and a black customer comes in and wants to deposit a significant amount of money, and literally the police got called because of a belief that this must be a drug dealer, right? These are experiences that people have. So the question then becomes, how do you talk to your employees? How do you train them to understand what appearances mean, and how stereotypes can infect how you do business? And these are things that I think it comes back to compliance management systems and really, really strong prioritization of the people who run those systems. It has to be seen as, the chief compliance officer needs to be right up there with the chief legal officer next to the CEO, and the CEO has to be saying, you are the most important person in this company after me, right? That's the message that has to be out there. And then a lot of things can change. The other thing I would say is that even where we don't have precise data, there are best practices that both the industry develops and that the regulators pull together. Places like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and so forth. And the companies that are the ones that I enjoy working with and the ones that I think are delivering the most to the challenges that we face in the civil rights area are those that see themselves as taking the lead in saying, we want to have the best practices. We want to be the leader. We don't want to just not be sued. We actually want to be the company that other people look to. How do we get there? And what do those companies do to get there? Well, the first thing they do is what I said, compliance management systems. Second is they partner up. They partner up with the Fair Housing Center, other civil rights advocates and experts and say, would you please come in and talk to us and tell us, what do you think we're doing right? What are we doing wrong? How can we be better? And then they spend time looking around at what the regulators, who should not be their enemies, the regulators are in so many instances simply trying to help business get a template for what makes sense. But engage the regulators as partners as well. Reach out to them and say, how and where can we be doing better? Or even if you're nervous about that, simply look at the guidance that's there and ask the regulators to interpret it for you. Don't be afraid about doing that. Build those relationships. What does this mean, right? Because it's never the companies that reach out that end up being the target of lawsuits by regulators, or rarely by advocates. It's those that say, we can't address this problem, it's impossible, we're not going to look at it, and tend to sort of put their heads in the sand. Those are the ones that end up in the place that they don't want to be in the end. So you have to fight that kind of instinct, and build those metrics where you can.
I'm a legal services attorney, and I'm just wondering how you find your cases or how they find you, and are you able to take on everything you want to? Just what does your practice look like?
We can't take on everything we want to. We just don't have enough people. There are too many cases. So that's just not possible as much as we would like it to be. The cases come to us really through a big network. A lot come through advocacy organizations, fair housing centers, like the Fair Housing Center of Washtenaw. Well, it used to be Washtenaw, Southeast Michigan. But the National Fair Housing Alliance is is a creation of an alliance of now really more than 200 fair housing organizations around the country, and we've done tremendous amount of work for so many of those organizations that end up bringing us cases. There are other lawyers that bring us cases. There are people who simply call because they hear about the work that we've done. There are sometimes even government lawyers or government agencies that will say, we're not doing this case, but we think this is a case that your firm should be involved in. So it really comes from all over. You know, there aren't that many law firms doing this type of work, being dedicated to this type of work. And frankly, there aren't even that many overall fair housing lawyers in the country. So if you do this work and the work gets known, the cases find their way to you sort of, one way or the other.
Okay, I think it's time for us to end the breakfast today. Thank you, John, for being here.
Thank you all.